We are live. I'm going to jump right into it. My name's Adam Mansour. I am a CISO for over 30 companies in our SMB space here at Act Zero. We've got a Ask Me Anything set up today. I'm going to be going through a number of questions that we've compiled from different discussions, but your questions take priority. So if you jump on and want to ask something, feel free. We're going to be going through a few different streams, two streams. And the first stream is, before people have MDR, I think they have a couple of very big concerns about how to sort of prioritize different things in cybersecurity. And when you look to, ask questions of a CISO, that's typically one where you're like, well, what do I do next? How am I going to kind of create my program? And so there's really a number of questions we kind of accumulated from those experiences is, before you go out and try to buy cybersecurity, when do you typically ask an expert or ask somebody for guidance? And the next one is, within the MDR, after you have kind of managed detection and response, you got a full SOC and everybody's sort of finding and stopping threats. You have a bunch of things that MDR has found for you, right? Other opportunities to reduce your risk. And so there's a lot of questions that we get, after. So it's kind of good to think about it. If I did have a SOC and it was running really well, what kinds of things, do CISOs still get asked after that? So I'm going to start off with some of those questions and hopefully give you all a chance to ask some throughout. But let's just get started. So the first one is, sometimes you have people come up to you and ask, well, my partner got hacked, right? So you have a hosting company, Salesforce, or you've got, a third party, right? You use a particular CRM app or something like that, and they got hacked, right? And the question is that we hear pretty often is, does their breach put anything on my shoulders in terms of having to notify my customers or the privacy offices in my jurisdiction about this particular attack? And the answer is that it depends on the kind of data that you were hosting with that particular provider. If you were hosting a database that had personally identifiable information, and you believe that there is significant harm that can come to the people by this data leaving, well, then you probably should be familiar with how to notify the privacy offices of the jurisdictions, the geographies that those people belong to, and walk through that. Go through the process of filling out the forms and letting them know who was affected and what happened, because it may affect your users. If you don't believe that there's significant harm, and this happens all the time, right? You hear about breaches from everything from LinkedIn to Yahoo to Yahoo doesn't exist anymore, but any one of these major firms that suffers a data breach, and you're like, well, my username and password may have gone missing. Do I feel like my customers maybe have LinkedIn profiles augmented in your own sales database to give them pictures or something? Do I have to let people know about this? There's not much to do there, right? Most of the advice is typically, once you get breached, if your partner gets breached, then you have to think about the data you're hosting with them. And if it's a provider that, let's say your LinkedIn, you're worried that when LinkedIn got breached, for example, that your specific username and passwords, which may have been used by your staff both on your computers and LinkedIn, well, when you hear about breaches like that, you want to kind of monitor and find out, from something like Have I Been Pwned or other services like that are free, what kind of user emails that happen in my organization were also part of that breach, and then just use that to tell people to reset passwords. Now, another thing that we get is a question about, how do I prove value to my boss, right? We hear this all the time. Risk is an essential service, right? If you think about, police departments and fire departments, the city never really tries to justify why they exist, right? They understand they're an essential service and that it's really part of doing, your community, keeping it safe and preparing for a bad day, right? And cybersecurity is hard to articulate to most management staff that are looking at IT as a back office and just saying, look, you guys have, a particular budget and you have to deliver a certain value for that budget. And we're going to reevaluate what we're getting from a productivity or return on investment or other things like that. So sometimes sometimes it's hard for an IT security engineer, especially in tough times like we're in now, with COVID. A lot of people are looking at different departments to try to see if they can shave costs. And it would be wrong to assume that IT wasn't one of the places that they look. And so when you look to prove value to your superiors, they typically are going to look for how those investments are amortized and calibrated for the future. And so you're likely going to end up weighing the costs sometimes of getting breached against the costs of the tools and the people that you've hired to prevent that activity. You're also going to look at ways that you're driving down risk as metrics to say, look, we're deploying a certain amount of capital, certain amount of money, and we've got these risks on the go, and we're reducing them. And then that's how we're going to measure success in this essential service that is cybersecurity, so that your superiors can understand, one, this is something that has to happen, and the progress that you're making is typically what they want to see. Is they want to see this sort of evolving sort of reduction of risk, because they think about things in three ways, right? Time, money, and risk. How are you de-risking the business from impacts? How are you spending the money, and how are you spending your time? So that's the best way to sort of tell your boss, how do we do it? And focus on the kinds of achievements that you may have made in the past 6 months, the types of things that you're able to action without, saying we're going to buy this and we're going to buy that, because executives want to know what they got for their money, as well as understand how much you need and why you need it, right? The other thing is, we hear a question a lot about remote work, right? When we think about remote work now more than ever, we're hyper focused on what can we be doing from a security perspective, given that we're in a pretty fragile state, right? This is kind of some people put it as war footing, right? Like when you were sort of spread out and economizing on almost everything from your VPN and your laptops that are now shipped outside of your purview. Maybe you can't get access to change policies on them or configure them, or your users' networks are sort of vulnerable, and it puts excess anxiety on the IT department now that in some cases it's in a security department. They just want to know, what are some best practice tips that we can give to our users? And the first thing that I would say, and I'll keep it to three so that it's very basic, is that you have to stay in touch with your users and remind them about the cybersecurity risks that they face from the increase of things like phishing and email scams and other types of issues that you would face at work, but you'd have a whole bunch of other, sort of behaviors that are just locked into the way people operate at work in terms of accessing websites and connecting to emails and going from personal to work, and those lines are certainly blurred. So stay in contact with them, right? Send them a small newsletter, small things they can do to spot a phishing scam, or look at password security and things like that. How to connect to networks, right? Should they be changing their own home network, that kind of thing. These are very obvious, simple things that IT can do. Just set up very home best practice type things and stay in contact. Just keep your users on a fairly up-to-date sort of newsletter campaign that will make sure that they're enforcing the security, because that's who's the custodians of this at the end of the day. When you're working from home, your user is in charge of making sure their security is good. The other two things I'd say is that obviously you want a fairly robust remote access setup, right? You're going to want to talk about your VPN and your security there. How are you enforcing things coming inbound and checking the policies, using that opportunity obviously to push software updates and things that you probably normally do, or vulnerability scans, or whatever it is for people that are connecting in, and just make that part of the ecosystem, right? Try to keep the VPN on all the time, maybe change the performance there so that you have some sort of access to that remote access that is much more remote now because it's not checking in before. So keep in contact with your users, try to use your VPN to sort of establish a normal of managing those assets remotely. And then, third is to try to focus on when users are remote and you look at those policies and you look at the remote access, that there's a certain amount of guidance that we're giving them about the increased scams from things like remote meetings, things such as new remote tools, because a lot of people will be setting up things like conference calls, Zoom meetings, and so these new technologies, obviously everybody may have heard about Zoom bombings, people showing up at their meetings, potentially grabbing passwords from flaws in those. So we do need to be a little bit more focused on setting up our own little security policies for things like Zoom assume, changing the settings if we're using them for corporate, right? Because some people would be seeing these for the first time and using them much more frequently, right? Perhaps, things like soft PBXs, they're coming back, right? These telephone systems that can be accessed over the internet. And so obviously these new systems that were rolled out fairly dramatically quickly, they need to be focused on as well from a security perspective. So I'd say those are kind of three things you can do. Just keep people up to date about what they can do for their own security. Make sure your remote access policy gives you a little bit of normalcy when it comes to managing the endpoint. And then third, try to take those new pieces of software, whether it's Teams or SharePoint or whatever you've just released to the masses, and say, maybe we should take a quick look at a best practices hardening guide to make sure we have a secure config for that new software. Another question we get fairly recently is, what should I be learning? Where should I be seeking, education or other opportunities to better myself in cybersecurity? And this is a question that we get a lot. Career advice. There's a lot that we do with in conjunction with other companies to try to tell people coming up in cybersecurity or transitioning from networking to cybersecurity. And those kinds of things are somewhat vague for most people. Maybe you're coming from an application development background. Maybe you're coming from a networking background. Maybe you're not even coming from IT. I've had people in the music business transition over to cyber and say, what can I do to learn? And so there's obviously different resource pools, but I tend to think of your cybersecurity career in three major buckets, right? Because there's three places you can kind of focus your attention and energy, right? Some people, they like the cool, sexy part of cybersecurity, right? The hacking. And so there's, obviously a lot of resources for people who are looking to train and turn themselves into a penetration tester or an auditor of sorts. And so there's materials there in terms of how you better yourself by, looking like things like the Certified Ethical Hacker certification, or you look at like a SANS security course, or you look online now, some things like DEF CON was free this year, right? A lot of resources for the public that are now free. You can sign up for DEF CON. And so that was something that was free this year. And so a lot of people, especially as you look at a lot of these familiar trade shows that were in cybersecurity, like Black Hat or DEF CON, or even your local security show, there's one in Toronto called Sector, right? There's a lot of places where they'll have little workshops that'll sort of walk you through a particular thing. So take a look at the workshops, the syllabus is there. That's really good when you want to get into doing cybersecurity. You want to be a practitioner of maybe auditing, or you want to go through a penetration testing career. The second one is to operate, cybersecurity technologies, right? And this can be much more broad, but you typically focus on what a good technology or a very popular technology is, say the cloud or a firewall. And you become an expert in that, right? You learn a lot about that, because that is a very viable career. One is, an auditor and a pen tester, maybe somebody that, frequently looks at, different networks or customers. And as an analyst, they'll go and tell you where you have holes and tell you how to fix them, right? That's a career opportunity in cybersecurity and a place for people to learn from scratch. The second one is to transition to a technical role where you are considered either consultant or an in-house person that is working with a particular security technology. And this is where, again, you can look for, popularity in a lot of places, right? Gartner will tell you what the best technology is, or the most popular technology is, with their Magic Quadrant. And there'll be other places that you can ask around with friends or others. But picking that particular technology and then sort of working through their own material, whether it be Palo Alto or Cisco or Amazon, and going through their courseware, because that's going to obviously be a trajectory that'll take you somewhere. And then that kind of puts you in a good blue team spot. Maybe you sort of go to 2 or 3 different technologies, and then you can kind of team lead a SOC or go up from there. And the third one is obviously, a different animal altogether, which is sort of, source code related. It kind of requires that you sort of end up as a developer. You hear pen testers, there's sort of a niche group, right? You might think of them as such, but there's a whole other discipline outside of managing technology and managing penetration testing, which is around, software development and focusing around security practices and refining your skills there. So it depends where you're coming from and where you want to end up, right? There's different career trajectories, and no two are the same, right? Like everybody can, the person from that music business ended up running the call center for a very big security company, and then working her way into recruiting. And so, you could kind of, navigate where you want to go. But, if you're looking for opportunities, I'd say those are great places and great resources that don't cost a lot for you to start investing in. So open web application security projects, other security groups, meetups, things like that for the software developer. And then, of course, technicians and other people can work in the middle stream, or SANs and CEH from there. Another question we get is, how should I be thinking about, 24/7? What does it actually mean? What is the value? And most of the time when people think about scaling their operation, maybe they run a SOC, or they have one or two people on their IT team that are responsible for IT security, and then they turn around immediately and say, well, should we be doing this 24 hours a day? And I'd say during the pandemic, a lot of IT teams maybe had to scale to 24/7, right? There may be operations to do just support that had to go to 24/7. And so you hear about 24/7, I think, increasingly. And the reason is that a lot of your IT systems are available 24/7. You may have, a particular view that security, just like, 911 or, another one of these services, needs to be available at a moment's notice at any moment of the day, because it's so critical, right? And you might have an emergency at any point in time. But what's different about, some of those, physical security, the night watchman or the 911 service is what cybersecurity is today, right? And what you should be thinking about is, where are the best opportunities for me and the analysts that work on this particular problem? And it could be just generalist IT, NOC, SOC, depending on what you want to call it, your help desk, that are going to go to 24/7. And you have to look at how things are structured in terms of getting those people information. Are they simply responding to alerts? You have your cybersecurity maturity to the point where if a system makes a noise, a person just needs to look at it and make it happen. Maybe that whole thing's automated with SOAR and you don't even have that issue. And so, what's the point? If you look at, the activities that they're performing, are they doing audits all the time? Are they, doing threat hunting constantly? Because those activities, they have deltas between when they're actually doing something and when they're not. So even if you were, physically performing them 24 hours a day, you have to look at that and understand, what activities are there. So I think the concept of 24/7 should be evaluated with respect to what's happening 24/7. What do you need to happen 24/7? Do you just need a call center to be able to talk to a person and action something 24 hours a day? Do you need to use that as a mechanism to wake different people up? Because obviously there's different roles. Maybe the application owner or the login credentials or whatever you need for this particular service, that person's going to go to bed. So you just need a service that makes sure that they can monitor for you and then get that person up or take an action and wait for that person to come back. So I think it's as you construct the function that should be executed 24 hours a day, you then understand whether you need to staff 24 hours a day. But given that there's a lot of hard and fast rules around 24/7, and there's a rule of 8, right? This came from a bank I used to work at. They used to say, well, if you want to truly do 24/7, we've done the FTE calculations, and you're going to need 8 people, minimum 8 people, to cover things like vacation days and handoff and training and other things from the shift work. So it's kind of a simple hard and fast rule to say you're likely budgeting 8 people. Some people will say, oh, it's 3, but then you give yourself no capacity to cover if there's more than one. And so, yeah, I'd say of the other ones that we get, I'm just kind of working on one here. So one is with COVID-19 pushing companies for remote work, how would you recommend thinking about securing that transition? And there's going to be a lot of talk about, if you have going back to work Obviously, there's a different work environment. You got social distancing, other medical reasons that something's a certain way. You also have people that are probably going to be transitioning to and from the office quite frequently, and nobody knows for sure exactly what their design might be in the coming months. Anyway, is a lot of things are still up in the air. But when you look to secure a transition between in-office and out-of-office work, is you want to be able to have the same capabilities that you do to protect assets that are just sort of transitioning in and out of the office, right? And this puts an excess burden on fundamentals, right? Asset inventory, connectivity. Those are things that have to persist, right? So where you used to be able to say, well, laptops are usually in the office, and therefore, access to systems such as, your Active Directory or your patch system or, some sort of inventory system is under control. You're probably looking at, having to do that remotely now and consistently, whether the asset is in the office or out. When you looked at things like SaaS providers and cloud providers, we get a lot of questions about, now that we've got these new cloud tools or these new SaaS tools, what are the security programs that should go around them? Because we've done such a good job, and we've had this isolated, virtual machine data center with our crown jewels in it before, and now we're starting to extend. We have this kind of like triangle that goes to the cloud, the data center, and the endpoint, and now we're sort of looking for opportunities there. So back to fundamentals again, with the connectivity, you have that asset management, you have that inventory management, you have policies that should be able to be applied similar to how you would, your hardening and your configuration and assessment of those things. If you're losing, your mind trying to think of how to even get started in those places, because, you set up teams last week because your boss told you to, use a benchmark, right? Go to something like CIS, right? Center for Information Security. They have benchmarks on a wide variety of different SaaS apps and other things like that can help you tune the settings, because you're probably not going to be able to apply the same exact thinking to your data center as you do to SaaS apps, right? There's no operating system, network, logs in some cases. So you're probably not going to be able to just, retrofit your data center security monitoring and modeling around what you were doing with your servers and workstations in your office directly to the cloud or even to remote work, right? You probably can't even leverage the same tools, which is unfortunate to say to an IT person who probably spent a lot of time making their office super secure and cool. But that's going to be where you got to go back to the fundamentals and just say, look, we need to manage, we need connectivity, we need to go up and harden these new systems that we got so that we are in a good position to come in and out of the office and have the same information come back to our director or IT manager that says, this is what we got, this is how secure it is, these are what the vulnerabilities are, this is what we're pushing to people, and we're not loosening everything so it's just the wild, wild west just because we had to come in and out of the office. New question, with a finite budget for detection and response, how should I approach prioritizing my investments across the enterprise? I put together a webinar a while back about how to basically create a budget for cybersecurity, and part of it was we also created an incident response guide. It was like an asset that allowed you to sort of prioritize certain things happening as a very likely and a very costly risk, right? So if we look at things like not addressing GDPR compliance. If we're a British company that's likely going to get the attention of or have had complaints from the ICO, then that $17 million fine, or £1 million fine, I should say, is likely our single greatest risk, right? Probably even higher than ransomware, because it would probably impact us more than that, right? It's not surprising to hear me say that, but these are ways that you have to prioritize your risks. Say, how likely is it to get hit with this thing? How likely is it for us to have an outcome that costs this money, right? Like ransomware. Now, when you have those kinds of risks sort of tabled, you're now going to start to play the cost benefit analysis, right? You have to look at like Moneyball, the movie or the book, depending on, how you see your budget should be, how can I get the most value for this? And what's the fastest time? So again, time, risk, money. That's how, most CIOs see things. You should see it the same way. When you're trying to prioritize your assets, you need to look at whether you should build or buy something, right? Is this a core competency of mine? Is this something that I'm really good at, or the team is really good at? Is this something that we're going to continue to be good at and continue to invest in? And there are times, if you're a large bank, for example, that you've definitely got, a reason, right? It's the bank. Nobody wants to be allowed in. You build the vaults, you build the security programs. You're really good at doing that. Double down, right? Do that in the digital sense and make sure that every part of your app is secured in-house and you're leading the way there. But if you're a small provider and, you can't staff it, you don't know it, it's not good for you, then outsource, right? Try to look for a consultant or an organization that will cost effectively give you the results you're looking for and persist over time so you get better ROI. And that's the best way to sort of look at your budget. Take that purse, take that, piggy bank, however big it is, and sort of split it up. And again, I've got some hard and fast rules here too, right? On average, people spend between 6% of their IT budget on security, right? So if you buy a new app, 6% should be set aside for securing it, right? Whether that's hardening, whether that's a process, consultancy, tools, technology, whatever it is, just save 6 points. Almost add a security tax to everything that you're buying, and that way you'll have sort of the right budget framework for yourself to say, I've allocated a certain amount. And then you can start to prioritize what out of your bucket is the most important relative to your risk. And that's kind of the best way to sort of do it. Now, the easy way to do it, obviously, is to look at lists, to look at your budget, to look at the market, compare 3 people, compare 3 vendors, and then make a decision. And that's typically how you would do it. And obviously, some people have a hard time doing that because we always say the biggest competitor in all spaces is do nothing, because it's a lot easier to just sort of sit back and deal with IT because it's IT and not deal with any of the forethought of risk. But unfortunately, there is a cost to that too. So you should be good at articulating. And if you watch that budgeting seminar that I put on in Bright Talk, you'll be able to check that out too. There's a way to count, how much it would cost us if we did nothing and something happened. And that's how you should. The GDPR fine is an example of that. Ransomware per record or per system or per hour out of business, is also a way to do that. Another one is we see a vendor saying they use AI as a way to reduce alert fatigue. What does that really mean? How do I evaluate these claims? So there's a lot of, I don't want to spend too much time the preamble to this being that, there's certain ways AI is applied in technology. One of the disciplines being machine learning and taking, these sort of patterns or ability for a particular part of data science to find something and speed up the ability to either inform or automate or do some other function that is done previously by a person. And when you say AI, artificial intelligence, that's usually what they're talking about when they're talking about the application of artificial intelligence into a technology or data-driven process like, alert fatigue. Alert fatigue is, for those who have never heard this before, let's say you buy a technology that sends you notifications. Let's say it's, pager duty and something goes down, right? You get 56 alerts a minute that, some threshold is in or out of weight. And then, the admin that's supposed to be watching his phone diligently, ready to act to bring that server back to life, it gets alert fatigue. They're like, oh man, this thing rings every 10 seconds. I got to turn it off, right? Like I can't handle it anymore, or I'm not going to pay as much attention to it anymore. And it becomes, not as valuable, right? Because now you have this whole system put in place to tell you there's a problem. And because it tells you about too many problems or tells you about problems in the wrong way, that you really kind of ignore it and it's no longer useful. But when you take that AI component and say, let's layer that on top, maybe there's something in the way the alerts are being sent or the information in the alerts. And therefore, we're going to solve alert fatigue by the machine learning algorithm within AI coming up with what you should really focus on. So kind of making the alerts the data input to a different system that then says, I'll dig through this and tell you which one, Mr. Human, needs to be paid attention to, or only surface a subset of those alerts. And that's what I think those vendors are trying to communicate about how their AI works. But there's a certain level of I'm going to say truth to that. It's true if they're doing it, right? If they say they're doing something and they're doing it, they're doing it. But there's a level of effectiveness to that being done that I think probably should be evaluated, right? What are you really gaining by somebody taking a bunch of alerts and having a machine learning algorithm decide whether or not they're valuable? Intrinsically, the marketing would tell you, I have to pay attention to a lot less, so it's a lot more optimized to make my day work a lot smoother. But the truth is that may tell you things that junk in, junk out, right? So if you got a bunch of bad alerts and they're going into the AI and ML, what do you think is the extraction of value on those base alerts? It's probably pretty small, right? Because they were garbage in the first place. That's it. So it's probably better to focus on what kinds of things are those alerts really intending to look at in the first place? If they're cybersecurity threats and your correlation engine on your SIM is just putting out way too much garbage, then you probably aren't looking at the right data in the right way. You're not doing, threat hunting or anything that extracts real attacks out of that data set. And so, just adding a bad set of alerts to something like AI or ML is the wrong question. It's kind of like, where do you start? What are the things that you're actively looking for? How confident are you that you're really finding, material threats that put the organization at risk, and then maybe add ML or AI to that model and say, find those faster. That's really important. Like we do at IntelliGO, right? Now, there's other kinds of questions that we get around managed detection and response. So after we have that, these are the first couple of questions. Usually are from people that are coming to the organization with what am I going to do next in cybersecurity? I have all these kind of concerns about how do I spend my time, my money. I'm looking at something like work from home, and I need to sort of fix that problem. Then there are people that have a security operations center, right? They have MDR. And they are now informed about new things, right? And what kinds of things are they informed about that they weren't informed before? Like a fire alarm, right? You have something that should detect something, and maybe you weren't able to detect it before. Let's say you had your firewall and your antivirus previously, and they gave you certain levels of alerts when they found something, and you kind of know what to do there. But let's say you have a real attacker that goes through the antivirus and through the firewall, and those things don't set off any alerts, and they start doing something malicious. Well, if you have a managed detection and response provider, they can give you very simple information to say this particular attacker used this, script or something to access certain information. And with that newfound knowledge, we get questions a lot to say, well, how do I report this breach? Should I report this breach? Like the incident response guide, we've developed a quick matrix, right? Because every privacy office, if it's PII, for example, that's one way to report a breach. There's other things like health information or other types of information like credit card information that you have to report to different bodies. So you have to know what kind of information goes to what kind of reporting body. But if it's PII, if it's personally identifiable information, your address and biometrics or something like that, and that's something that your MDR provider is now telling you about, then you need to know, the province, the state, or the home country in the EU as a simplification to notify. You need to know the office and the breach form and things like that. So you kind of need to know what information was accessed, and then you need to walk through it. So we created a very simple matrix that helps you find all these locations, because they're hard. They're sort of locked away in government websites, but they make for a quite simple, a process. When you say, I've got them all organized, I have kind of like the poison control hotline is sort of how we've structured it. You can detect with the MDR service, and then it'll help you report to identify the individuals and then walk through that. And when you have MDR, obviously, at a company like IntelliGO, you may have, a virtual CISO that can walk you through that process. You may have, your threat hunter can tell you what to do. So there's a lot of, reliance on some basic materials, but it should be pretty evident, right? You'll know when you need to report a breach and how to report a breach, and then you just sort of walk through it. It shouldn't be as difficult before. I think the reason most people struggle with this is because either they don't know they've been breached because they don't have an MDR provider, or they don't have the tools or the skills or the process to pull that out. And then they don't know whether to assess significant harm, right? They find out that they lost personally identifiable information, but they're not sure if it's putting anybody at risk, right? So maybe they do, maybe they don't, right? That's when you need a coach, right? Maybe a threat hunter that can tell you, yeah, that's a problem. Here's the reasons why it could be a problem. And then how to, like, here, go send this to this form, record this information, and you should be good. And there's no liability thereafter. The other question we get a lot is Office 365. I mean, this is, I'm going to sum this up to cloud, right? Like, how do I secure? How do I improve? How do I monitor? What do I do around SaaS apps, right? And so many more applications are obviously being serviced in the cloud. There's no operating system. They don't let you get access to the network. You can't really install your antivirus on Salesforce. So, you try to see people apply these sort of legacy data center workstation protocols, such as logging and antivirus and prevention tools and networking tools, to an environment that is not conducive to that. There's no plugins, there's no APIs, there's no way to get access to, that particular interface. So, they're not going to let you install your antivirus on Salesforce. So I think that you need to understand for your application, first and foremost, what the best practice is for applying it, right? Just like buying a computer at Best Buy, there's certain things you can do to these environments to make them more secure. And these are tools that, these providers will give you. Microsoft, who, makes the Office 365 platform, they will have guides like at the CIS benchmark and recommendations to say, here's how you can set up two-factor authentication. We got a bunch of different providers that you can use to connect in and make sure nobody hacks into the website, right? We've got, policies that are set up in these applications that say, I don't want to allow attachments in my emails to go through without anti-spam inspection, right? And this is all part of setting your service up, right? And revisiting it over time, coming back maybe 6 months to a year later, and then finding out, that there's new policies, there's new opportunities to secure that application. So that's how you should probably think about it is, again, take a benchmark, take a best practice, take some configuration and put it on there. When you have infrastructure as a service, which people use the Office 365 or Amazon sometimes to mean, the SaaS apps, and sometimes they mean the IaaS, right? Infrastructure as a service, which is basically you hosting your service and your server in this cloud, right? So you've moved your, Windows machine or Linux machine up to the cloud to save money on the compute, right? Very common thing, right? But that people then think that you don't have to apply those old principles, and you definitely do, right? You do need the firewall, you do need the logging and the management and the remote access, securities, something from the cloud that can monitor the logs and tell you what's going on. And so you do have, some of those infrastructure as a service sometimes getting conflated or coupled together with the SaaS apps, and you need to decouple them. You need to know when you're doing infrastructure as a service and when you've just got an application that's got security settings and policies and need to apply it, because those old school thinking, and this is, I think, that the most common two places that people get burned when they think about their cloud environments is they either think about it in the old way when the old way doesn't apply in the SaaS case, or they forget about it because they assume SaaS covered some of those IaaS use cases. And no, Microsoft is not deploying a firewall to prevent, malicious actors from guessing your password on the credential screen. You need to fix that with the policies in the SaaS app. No, when you deploy a server and you set up RDP, open to the internet, that nobody at Microsoft is analyzing the logs on your server to tell you that somebody's breaking in and changing settings. So you have to do that. You have to deploy the software and the networking part in the IaaS sense, and you have to do the policies on the other side. The other question, third question here for post MDR. So if you have MDR, a question that we get common is how should CISOs calculate the return on investment of an MDR? Risk reduction. If you buy anything in cybersecurity, you need to check your risk over time and say, is it getting better? Right? Are we reducing more and more risks with this service? Have we eliminated more vulnerabilities? Are we continuing to improve our hygiene, our best practice, our hardening, our benchmarking? Right? Are we following those practices? Are we getting more and more of them and getting more secure? Right? Are we inching along as those things change to harder to hack? Right? And the more of those things that you do, the more you can calculate from those risks what your posture is, like how much your return on investment has happened, right? Because you'll know how much money you spent over time. That's easy to count. But you should be counting the other factor of success, which isn't how much you put in, but what you got out. And some people like to say, did I save time? Did I save money? Maybe not, right? But again, it's an essential service. And the essential part of it is that you are taking the risks that you know about and you're removing them for the company. So the more you can calculate that risk, the more you can count down, the better I think you're going to be at showing ROI to the company in general. And that's the return on investment. People tend to think of it in the stock market. How much money did I get for what I put in? How much did my stock appreciate in terms of price? And outside of economics, right, where your return on investment is the value you got, you need to think about it like that. What risks did I reduce? New question here. I have a lot of employees accessing company meetings and documents via their phones right now. Should we be monitoring their mobile phones? Work from home has another implication. It's a pretty big implication, and it's a privacy implication, right? When we look at the privacy regulations as they change from state to state and country to country, they're starting to become much more penalizing, much more penalties, financial penalties for companies that misuse and don't have the right to collect certain kinds of information and monitor certain things that are not their assets or not their purview. And cell phones open up a very specific part of this, right? Which is cell phones are built very differently in the operating system. While it may be easy for you to monitor the network, let's say, of your corporate network, and it may be something within your ownership, so you may have a right to do it. A user's phone tends to get a little bit more sticky. Number one, the operating system doesn't let you do a lot of these things in terms of monitoring. So even if you were, like, let's say, going through an app like OneDrive or something on their phone, or you were using email through the phone and they open it up on their phone, it operates in what we call single user space, right? So, it's kind of like a little single user jail cell where your data should stay in that app unless they open it in another application and move it over. So I'd say, the risks to things like viruses or exfiltration of data that's being monitored by a high risk actor, right? A hacker that's hacked your user cell phones and is using that to access your information. That the likelihood is very low there. I wouldn't say that it should bubble to the surface of your risk plan to start monitoring cell phones, because inherently the cell phone and single user space, specifically Apple, are very, very good at that. Android less, but there's not a lot of examples of Android viruses. I think it's probably more important that you focus on identity in that case, where you have to authorize your users to access public apps that they could from their phone or their desktop or whatever. And then those apps, like Duo or whatever, might be able to set up policies. Even Microsoft can do this. Set up policies to say you're not allowed to access it from this device or that device, a jailbroken device, that kind of thing. Right. So that would be how I would say you enforce it. Try to look at identity. The typical, process of things like antivirus or monitoring of the cell phone can open up a much greater area. So I'd say that's how you sort of handle it is lock down the identity and the types of devices that can connect to certain types of apps, set up policies to say what you're allowed to access there, and just keep your users in the know. Data loss is a very difficult thing to handle. If you're worried about losing data, that's a different thing, right? Where you're worried that now the data's gone out and the user's going to, hoard it or keep it or, go competitively somewhere else and take it. Much more difficult to enforce in today's day and age because of just how many protections there are on the apps and the phones and the things to alert the user that that's the case, and how many options they have for screen capture and recording and just taking data otherwise. So lock down the identity, leave it at that. Try not to monitor the cell phone. You can set up certain policies that will allow MDM and things like that. That's as far as we can go, I think, with the cell phones, and we should go, because honestly, it's a personal device. You get into the whole MDM and live life work, splitting the phone up, it becomes much more difficult. New question: is DLP dead, or do I still need it? Certainly, the computational complexity of data loss prevention has gone up. And what I mean by that is, I was master certified at a company called Vontu. Symantec bought them eventually. And they were kind of the leaders in data loss prevention from a technology perspective when I was there. And what we were doing was we were trying to set up very complex tools that would allow the company to understand whether data was used in a way that it shouldn't be. So, were credit cards leaving through unauthorized protocols like Facebook or, email that we didn't authorize? Were they in emails going back and forth to customers or prospects or things like that? And then the data complexity grew, right? So there was things like, the documents, right? What's sensitive to a bank in terms of a credit card isn't the only thing that's sensitive, right? Maybe they have, a venture capital department that's going to invest in new companies, and they don't want anybody to get access to these early stage deals because it'll erode their competitiveness in terms of what they're offering the company and the deal structure and all kinds of stuff. So we had all kinds of documents that we also had to index that made it a little harder. Now you think about the computational complexity. What if the venture capitalist department has, 1,000 documents that they want to index to make sure they don't go out in 100 different protocols, right? now you have a very difficult thing where you're saying, I have to check one data set, which is very large and very statistically hard to say is 100% sensitive or not sensitive. And I have to apply that to things like cell phones and laptops and other things like that. So it's a lot harder because there's so many new protocols. The data is much more complex. The use cases are so complex to set up enforcement and even detection within a high level of accuracy. You'll create a lot of alert apathy and data loss for sure. So I would say that if your primary concern is data loss, you're probably better to start with what privacy, regulation is asking you to do, which is just write down the kinds of data you have that is sensitive from a loss perspective, probably not as much intellectual property, but more PII, healthcare records, other sensitive information. Document those things and say, where are they? How long do we store them, et cetera? And you'll have a bit of a template that gets you through something like privacy regulation. And then when you look to add technology to monitor the use of that, if it's structured data like credit cards, maybe you can implement some of those features on the network or through an endpoint and be successful at monitoring for loss against your PCI DSS or something like that. But otherwise, it's not a technology that's had a lot of success given the extraordinary cost and the very difficult implementation for most companies. I'd say it's not as worthwhile today as it was in the past to investigate it. New question, do I need to actively monitor my OT systems, or is air gapping sufficient if I'm checking the logs every so often? Honestly, operational technology, and you get this, facilities in IT have been separate for many years for a reason, right? We have a different training program. We typically come from different places. And then there's, engineering and technician work and things that go into a lot of operational technology. And when you look at operational technology, you almost immediately hear IoT, right? Internet of Things, because you start to see this bridging between sensor technology, your temperature gauges, your, what have you, water pumps, whatever. And they want to try to use, IP networking, or they want to use another, wireless communication over networking like CDMA or something. And so you end up with, IT now getting kind of halfway visible, right? There's potentially traffic that's being sent over the IP network. There's potentially devices now, and those devices may have, a cheapy Linux operating system or something that can put the company at risk. And so you'll start to see IT now look at this and go, okay, well, is it me or is it the facilities? Is it the vendor? What should I be doing here? And this is kind of the great debate around OT and IoT is what kind of risks are there? What kind of access do I have? Very similar to the SaaS argument. What can I put on that device? Do I put something on the device? Do I monitor the network? What if it's Bluetooth to a PAN device and I can't see the traffic in between? Technically, it's a very interesting thing. It's a great place to focus as IT because, we're technicians by heart and we love to focus on the hard problems. And this is a hard problem because, it's so diverse. You can't apply the old thinking necessarily. And so what I'd say is that air gapping, which is the idea that you don't let it touch the IP network or Internet Protocol network, the IT network, the same one you use for servers and workstations and things like that. That's certainly a great approach, but it's probably not going to last forever. Right? Eventually it'll bridge. There'll be some kind of PAN gateway, right? Physical access network or some kind of gateway that ends up on the IP network that these things are connected to that can send traffic through it. And this was the same thing whenever we used to do, train security and SCADA networks. You'd have this network that electronically runs the train, and then you'd have one device that connects it to the IP network, right? And that's where all the Windows machines, NT4 Windows machine, running the controller for the train, and everybody goes, oh my God, it's an old thing, we have to protect it. So there's likely always going to be a bridge. I think that, when you introduce IT or IoT technology, OT or IoT technology into the network, air gapping is a great way to sort of, forget the problem, but there's likely going to be something that interfaces directly with it, either a cloud service that uses credentials and identity that, maybe can get, other access to a reporting server that's bad. So look at the architecture, see what's showing up on the IP network, if anything, if there's a PAN gateway or something that's connecting it to the network, and segment it off, air gapped it a little bit, and then otherwise just, look to monitor it, right? These devices are quite hard to monitor. Those Linux systems, very hard to get an agent for or anything like that because they're so lightweight. I mean, it's a Raspberry Pi. You're not going to get a ton of, sophistication in terms of operating system detections. But certainly you start to see very popular attacks like that attack on the day Netflix went down and they attacked Dyn DNS. It was through, 10,000 compromised IoT devices apparently. So somewhat cool and important, but air gapping, a good idea. Look at the architecture, find out if there's an interface to your network, log network segment, try to keep it separate, apply the rules of least privilege, like zero trust, right? Try to keep it segmented off, and you might have a decent time managing that problem. Conclusion. Why would a CISO consult a CISO? And I get this question a lot. If you're great as a CISO, that's great. I'm glad there are other people out there that have similar experience or better experience than me. There's tons. I mean, nobody knows everything, right? And I think when you look at a CISO, you probably want a specialist, right, for something. And that's when you probably want a bench of CISOs that can interact with you on a particular subject that you may be a little green on. Sure, you could research it yourself. Sure, you could go through the process of becoming a specialist at understanding how to harden Amazon. But it's not easy, right? And it takes a lot of time. So you're probably better if you're a CISO to CISO communication at choosing a specialist, right? You might own a car, but there's times you need to take Uber, right? Because it's just not practical to move through space sometimes with that attitude. So that's when I think you should look at a CISO. Is sometimes case specific, right? And if you have a bench or a retainer based, vCISO, maybe they can pitch into places that you're not good at. Maybe you're an expert at the legal profession and the IT policies around attorney-client privilege, and that real good, and how to harden email or something like that. But you're going to move to Salesforce and you want a pro there. So those are the questions we have for now. I thank everybody for asking the new questions. Really appreciate it. We really want to keep doing these if they're helpful for you. So let us know what you think online, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much.